The studio was alive with sound. Cameras rolled. Red lights blinked. The quiet hum of air conditioning mixed with the low murmur of an attentive audience. Jordan Peterson was speaking, confidently, precisely, the way he always did when exploring deep questions about meaning, suffering, and belief. Every sentence landed with structure. Every word felt deliberate. This was familiar territory for him. Then something changed. Across from him sat Jonathan Roumie. Calm still. Listening. Not waiting to interrupt. Not preparing a counter-argument. Just listening. Peterson paused for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable. But enough for the atmosphere to shift. Roumie leaned forward slightly, not to challenge, not to debate, but to speak from somewhere deeper than intellect. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was simple. That was the moment everything stopped. Jordan Peterson, a man known for navigating complex ideas without hesitation, fell silent. His pen stopped moving. His eyes dropped from Roumie's face to the table in front of him. The studio, once filled with confident energy, suddenly felt suspended in time. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. You could feel it. That rare kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion, but from impact. This wasn't a debate. This wasn't a viral gotcha moment. This was something else entirely. The kind of moment that doesn't explode, it settles. Jonathan Roumie didn't raise his voice. He didn't quote scripture. He didn't try to sound wise. He simply spoke a truth that didn't ask for permission to be heard. And somehow, that truth landed so heavily that it interrupted one of the sharpest minds of our time. People watching live leaned closer to their screens. Comment sections would later explode with theories, reactions, and interpretations. But right then, in that studio, none of that mattered. What mattered was that for a few powerful seconds, words failed. Jordan Peterson wasn't offended. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't dismissive. He was still. And when a man who lives in ideas becomes quiet, you know something real has happened. No background music swelled. No producer cut to commercial. They let the silence exist, raw and unfiltered. Because some moments don't need editing. This was the kind of pause that makes people uncomfortable. Not because it's awkward, but because it forces reflection. The kind that slips past intellect and goes straight to the heart. Jonathan Roumie didn't smile. He didn't celebrate the moment. He didn't even look for approval. He simply sat there, grounded as if he knew something most people forget. That the most powerful words don't shout. They don't argue. They don't demand agreement. They arrive quietly and leave a room forever changed. And what Jonathan Roumie said next, the sentence that caused that silence, would be replayed, analyzed, and remembered long after the studio lights turned off. Because sometimes one honest line is enough to stop the world. To understand why that moment of silence mattered so much, you have to understand the room and the two men sitting inside it. This wasn't just another interview. It wasn't a casual conversation designed for quick headlines or shallow sound bites. The studio had been set up for something heavier, something slower. The topic for the night was meaning. Not the kind you can summarize in a quote, but the kind that only emerges when people are willing to sit with discomfort. Jordan Peterson had done this many times before. He sat upright in his chair, notes neatly arranged, pen resting between his fingers like a familiar tool. His voice carried authority, not because he demanded attention, but because he had earned it through years of thought, study, and confrontation with difficult ideas. When Peterson spoke, people listened, even those who disagreed with him. He had a way of pulling conversations into deeper waters, where easy answers stopped working. Across from him sat Jonathan Roumie. At first glance, Roumie didn't look like someone who belonged in a philosophical discussion. No stack of papers, no highlighted notes, no attempt to project intellectual dominance. He wore simple clothes, sat relaxed, and kept his hands folded loosely in his lap. But there was something about him that didn't need to announce itself. Jonathan Roumie wasn't there as an actor. He wasn't there as a celebrity. And he certainly wasn't there to win an argument. He was there as someone who had lived through inner change. The audience sensed the contrast immediately. On one side, a man whose life had been devoted to understanding the human condition through psychology, myth, and reason. On the other, a man whose transformation came through surrender, humility, and faith. Two paths toward the same question: what gives life meaning? The discussion began smoothly. Peterson spoke about responsibility, how meaning is often found not in pleasure, but in voluntarily carrying burdens. He referenced stories, ancient myths, and clinical experience, weaving them together with ease. Heads in the audience nodded. This was familiar ground. Roumie listened, not passively attentively. His eyes stayed on Peterson, not wandering to the audience or the cameras. When Peterson made a point, Roumie didn't rush to respond. He absorbed it. Let it sit. As if he understood that some ideas need space before they can be honored. When Roumie finally spoke for the first time, it was measured. He didn't contradict Peterson. He didn't challenge his logic. He agreed, but added something quieter. He talked about brokenness. About how many people chase purpose by trying to fix themselves, by becoming stronger, smarter, more disciplined, and still feel empty. He spoke without jargon, without theory. Just lived experience offered gently. The audience leaned in. Peterson asked questions, real ones, not traps. He probed carefully, curious rather than combative. Where do you think that sense of transformation comes from? He asked at one point. Roumie didn't answer immediately. He paused. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he was choosing the right way to say it. That pause mattered. It told the room that this wasn't performance. This wasn't branding. This wasn't a role being played. Whatever Roumie was about to say came from somewhere deeper than intellect. As the conversation continued, the contrast sharpened. Peterson analyzed belief through the lens of psychology, as something that organizes chaos, gives structure to suffering, and provides a framework for meaning. His words were precise, carefully built, intellectually honest. Roumie didn't reject that framework. He simply added something it couldn't explain. He spoke about moments when reason reaches its limit. About times when no amount of analysis can carry you through pain. About standing at the edge of yourself and realizing that self-reliance, the very thing we're taught to admire, can sometimes become a prison. There was no drama in his voice, no urgency, just truth offered without force. You could feel the audience beginning to sense it. This wasn't going to stay theoretical. This conversation was slowly drifting towards something personal, something that couldn't be debated away or reduced to a concept. Jordan Peterson noticed it too. His questions became slower, more careful, less structured. He wasn't steering anymore, he was listening. The studio energy shifted. This wasn't a clash of ideas. It was an approach. Intellect meeting surrender, analysis meeting experience, strength meeting humility, and somewhere in that space between logic and lived truth, a moment was forming. A moment that would stop the conversation entirely. A moment that would leave even Jordan Peterson, a man rarely without words, sitting in silence. But that silence hadn't happened yet. It was building, and when it arrived, it would arrive not as an interruption, but as a consequence. By the time the conversation reached its midpoint, the atmosphere in the studio had changed in a way no one could quite name, but everyone could feel. The discussion was no longer abstract. It wasn't floating safely in the realm of ideas, theories, or carefully constructed arguments. Something more personal had begun to surface, something heavier. Jordan Peterson leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers steepled, eyes focused on Jonathan Roumie with an intensity that signaled genuine engagement. This wasn't confrontation. It was curiosity sharpened by caution. He had sensed that Roumie wasn't speaking from ideology. He was speaking from somewhere deeper, somewhere earned. Peterson cleared his throat and asked the question that many in the audience had been waiting for. Faith, he said slowly, choosing each word with care, is undeniably powerful. But couldn't it also be understood as a psychological structure, a framework the mind builds to cope with chaos, suffering, and uncertainty? It wasn't an attack, it wasn't dismissive, but it was direct. The room leaned forward. This was the tension point, the place where belief often fractures under analysis, where conversations either collapse into defensiveness or spiral into endless abstraction. Many expected Roumie to respond with theology, scripture, or emotion. He did none of those things. Jonathan Roumie didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, resting calmly in his lap. His breathing slowed. The pause stretched longer than most people would be comfortable with on live television. Producers shifted slightly behind the cameras, unsure whether to intervene. But Roumie wasn't lost. He was listening, not just to the question but to what lived beneath it. He finally looked up, his expression steady, almost gentle. I think that explanation makes sense, he said, up to a point. The audience held its breath. Roumie acknowledged the psychological framework, not to flatter Peterson, but because he meant it. He spoke about how belief can organize suffering, give shape to chaos, and offer stability when life feels unbearable. He didn't argue against psychology. He respected it. And then, quietly, he shifted the ground. But there was a moment in my life, Roumie continued, where none of that worked anymore. Peterson's pen paused mid-air. Roumie described a season of his life marked by failure, disappointment, and exhaustion. Not dramatic tragedy, but the slow erosion of confidence that comes when effort doesn't lead to peace. He spoke of chasing purpose through disciplined success and self-improvement and still feeling empty. The words weren't rehearsed, they weren't polished, they were honest. I understood the theories, he said. I could explain the mechanisms, but understanding didn't heal me. The room was quiet now. This wasn't a refutation of psychology. It was something more unsettling, a testimony of its limits. Peterson listened closely. His expression was neutral, but something had shifted. This wasn't an argument he could map out. There were no terms to define, no assumptions to challenge. Roumie continued, his voice calm but steady. There came a point where I realized that my greatest problem wasn't chaos around me, he said. It was my belief that I could fix myself. That sentence landed heavily, not because it was dramatic, but because it contradicted one of the most deeply ingrained ideas of modern culture, that salvation comes through self-mastery. The audience stirred slightly, then went still again. Peterson's posture changed. He leaned forward now, elbows resting on his knees. This wasn't skepticism, it was attention. Roumie explained that faith for him wasn't something he constructed to feel better. It wasn't a mental framework he chose because it was useful. It emerged only after self-reliance collapsed. I didn't find faith because I was strong, he said. I found it because I wasn't. The tension in the room thickened. This wasn't a philosophical position, it was a confession, and confessions don't invite debate, they invite reckoning. Peterson opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, then stopped. His eyes narrowed, not in disagreement, but in contemplation. He looked down at his notes, then back up at Roumie, as if recalibrating. The audience sensed it too. This was no longer a discussion about whether faith could be explained psychologically. It was a confrontation with something psychology struggles to name: surrender. Roumie wasn't arguing that faith replaced reason. He was suggesting something more uncomfortable, that reason at its limits sometimes needs to step aside. The studio felt tighter now, heavier, the kind of tension that doesn't explode but waits. Peterson exhaled slowly. He hadn't responded yet. And for the first time that evening, it wasn't because he was choosing his words carefully. It was because the words hadn't arrived. The silence that would soon follow hadn't fallen yet, but it was close, very close. And when it came, it would mark the exact moment where explanation gave way to truth felt, rather than spoken. The silence didn't arrive suddenly. It settled. Jonathan Roumie finished his sentence and allowed the words to hang in the air, untouched. He didn't rush to soften them or explain them away. He didn't look around the room to gauge reactions. He simply sat back, hands folded again, breathing steady, as if he trusted the truth to do what it needed to do on its own. Across from him, Jordan Peterson remained still. His pen, which had been in near constant motion all evening, rested against the paper without making a sound. His eyes were no longer locked on Roumie. They had drifted downward, unfocused, as though he were looking inward rather than across the table. For a man whose life had been shaped by words, the absence of them was striking. The studio felt frozen, not tense, not awkward, but suspended. Time stretched in a way that only happens when something deeply human has just been exposed. No producer spoke into an earpiece. No one signaled for a transition. The cameras kept rolling, capturing something raw and unscripted. Jonathan Roumie broke the stillness, but only slightly. There was a moment, he said softly, when I realized I couldn't save myself. The sentence wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was absolute. Peterson's shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly. A slow breath escaped him, the kind you don't notice until it's already gone. His face held no sign of resistance, no skepticism, just recognition. Roumie continued, not pressing the point, not aiming for emphasis. I had spent my life trying to become enough, he said. Smart enough, disciplined enough, worthy enough, and the harder I tried, the more exhausted I became. The room stayed silent. This wasn't rhetoric, it was surrender spoken plainly. Peterson finally looked up. His eyes met Roumie's for a brief moment, not as interviewer to guest, but as one human being recognizing another. There was no challenge in his gaze. Only depth. He opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded once, slowly. The audience didn't react. No applause broke the moment. It was as if everyone understood instinctively that clapping would be an interruption, an attempt to escape the weight of what had just been said. Roumie wasn't finished, But he wasn't building toward anything either. He was simply telling the truth as it had happened. "I didn't choose faith because it was comforting," he said. "I chose it because everything else failed." That was the sentence, the one that changed the room. Jordan Peterson's pen slipped from his fingers and rested fully on the table. He didn't reach for it. He didn't adjust his notes. He sat back slightly, eyes steady, jaw set, not defensively but thoughtfully. For a long moment, he said nothing. In that silence, the studio became something else entirely. It was no longer a place for discussion. It was a place for reckoning. Peterson had spent decades analyzing belief systems, how they emerge, why they endure, what purpose they serve in the human psyche. He had articulated the necessity of meaning with unmatched clarity. But here, in front of him, was someone describing a truth that didn't ask to be analyzed. It simply existed. The silence stretched, 5 seconds, maybe 10. On live television, that feels like eternity. Peterson finally spoke, but when he did, his voice was different. "That," he said slowly, is a profound statement. No elaboration, no qualification, no counterpoint. Just acknowledgement. The weight of the moment lingered even after the words were spoken. The audience remained still, eyes fixed on the exchange. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, not because they disagreed, but because the conversation had reached a place that couldn't be observed from a safe distance. Roumie nodded slightly, not in victory, but in humility. This had never been about winning an argument. It was about revealing something true. Peterson glanced down again, as if considering 100 responses, and choosing none of them. His silence now wasn't hesitation, it was respect. In that pause, something subtle but powerful happened. The hierarchy of the conversation dissolved. There was no expert and no subject, no authority and no witness. Just two men confronting the same question from different directions, and finding themselves standing at the same edge. When the conversation resumed, it would never return to where it had started. Because once silence speaks, words can no longer pretend they are in control. The silence didn't end the conversation, it transformed it. When Jordan Peterson finally shifted in his chair, it wasn't to reclaim control of the discussion. It was to re-enter it differently. The energy in the studio had changed in a way that no lighting adjustment or camera cut could undo. Something honest had passed between two people, and everyone in the room could feel it. Peterson looked up again at Jonathan Roumie. His expression was no longer analytical in the way it had been earlier. The sharp edges were gone. What remained was curiosity softened by respect. "I want to be careful here," Peterson said quietly, almost to himself, "because what you're describing isn't theoretical." He paused, choosing his words not for precision, but for integrity. "When people speak like that," he continued, "they're not presenting an idea. They're revealing a lived truth." The audience exhaled as one. It was as if the room had been holding its breath without realizing it. Jonathan Roumie didn't respond immediately. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the weight of what Peterson had just said. He wasn't waiting to add more. He wasn't trying to extend the moment. He was letting it settle, the way someone does when they know a line has already been crossed, and there's no going back. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged glances. This wasn't the kind of exchange they could plan for. There was no music cue, no graphic, no easy transition. The moment demanded to be honored, not managed. Peterson leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The posture was subtle, but meaningful. It wasn't the stance of a lecturer anymore. It was the posture of someone listening with his whole body. "There's a point," he said slowly, "where competence and responsibility, as vital as they are, don't seem sufficient." The room remained silent. "That's not something I say lightly," Peterson added. "I've built much of my work around the idea that meaning comes from voluntarily bearing responsibility. And I still believe that." He paused again. "But what you're pointing to," he said, gesturing gently toward Roumie, "is the moment when even that isn't enough." No one interrupted. Roumie finally spoke, his voice steady but restrained. "Yes," he said, "responsibility matters. Discipline matters, but they can't redeem you." The word redeem landed carefully, not forcefully, not provocatively, but deliberately. Peterson nodded slowly, as if turning something over in his mind. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in concentration. This wasn't a rebuttal forming. It was something closer to reconciliation, the kind that happens when two truths don't cancel each other out, but demand to coexist. The audience began to shift, some nodding unconsciously, others sitting completely still. People weren't reacting emotionally. They were reflecting. Peterson leaned back again. looking up toward the studio lights for a moment, as though searching for language that wouldn't reduce what had just happened. "There's an old idea," he said. "That transformation requires a kind of death. The death of the old self." He glanced back at Roumie. "What you're describing sounds like that." Roumie's expression softened, not in relief but in recognition. "That's exactly what it was," he replied. "Not dramatic, not symbolic, just real." The conversation slowed further, each exchange measured, careful not to trample the ground they were standing on. This wasn't television pacing anymore. It was human pacing. The audience remained unusually quiet. No one checked their phone. No one whispered. Even the usual background noises of a studio seemed to disappear. Peterson rested his hands together, fingers interlaced. "There's a danger," he said softly. "I'm trying to reduce that kind of experience to a framework." He looked directly at Roumie. "And there's wisdom in knowing when not to." That sentence echoed. Roumie didn't smile. He didn't nod emphatically. He simply held Peterson's gaze for a moment, a shared acknowledgement that something important had just been said. The power of the moment wasn't in agreement. It was in restraint. No one tried to claim the last word. No one tried to dominate the meaning. No one tried to win. The studio had become a place where truth wasn't argued into existence. It was recognized. When the host eventually guided the conversation forward, it felt almost intrusive. Necessary but intrusive. The spell had been broken gently, but the residue of the moment remained. Viewers would later debate what this exchange meant. Some would call it philosophical. Others spiritual. Some would say nothing had been resolved. But everyone who watched felt the same thing. They had witnessed a rare moment where intellect bowed, not in defeat, but in humility. And that reaction, quiet, thoughtful, unforced, would be remembered long after louder moments were forgotten. As the conversation moved forward, it became clear that something irreversible had taken place. The tone could not return to what it had been before, not because the discussion had failed, but because it had deepened beyond performance. Jordan Peterson straightened slightly in his chair, though the intensity that once defined his posture was gone. What replaced it was a kind of grounded stillness. He wasn't trying to reclaim momentum. He wasn't searching for an intellectual foothold. He was allowing the conversation to evolve on its own terms. "I think what you've articulated," Peterson said after a long pause, "is the difference between understanding suffering and encountering it." He spoke slowly now, deliberately, as if each word needed to pass through something internal before reaching the room. "There are moments," he continued, "when the narratives we build, even the meaningful ones, collapse under the weight of lived experience." Jonathan Roumie listened with the same attentiveness he had shown from the beginning. He didn't interrupt. He didn't signal agreement or disagreement. He trusted Peterson to finish the thought. And in those moments, Peterson said, "What's left isn't ideology. It's something closer to truth." The audience remained completely still. Roumie nodded once. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's exactly it." There was no urgency in his voice, no need to emphasize the point. The resolution wasn't about reaching consensus, it was about clarity. Peterson looked at Roumie with a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not of amusement, but of appreciation. "You know," he said, "people often accuse conversations like this of avoiding conclusions." He paused. "But sometimes the most honest conclusion is recognizing where words fall short." The statement carried weight, especially coming from a man whose career had been built on articulating the inexpressible. The host glanced between the two men, clearly aware that something rare was unfolding. He allowed the silence to linger before gently guiding the discussion toward its closing moments. As the cameras continued to roll, Peterson shifted slightly and addressed Roumie directly. "I want to say this clearly," he said. "What you shared tonight required courage." He held Roumie's gaze, not because it was dramatic, but because it was unguarded. Roumie lowered his eyes briefly, then looked back up. "Thank you," he replied. "I didn't come here to persuade anyone. I just wanted to be honest." That honesty had reshaped the space. The conversation began to wind down, but the atmosphere remained unchanged. The audience wasn't restless. No one seemed eager to leave. It felt as though everyone present understood that they had witnessed something that couldn't be replicated. As the final minutes approached, Peterson offered a closing reflection, not as a summary, but as an acknowledgement. "There's a reason," he said. "That humility appears at the center of every enduring moral tradition." He paused, then added softly, "Because transformation doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with surrender." The word hung in the air, resonating deeply, Roumie didn't respond. He didn't need to. When the host thanked both men and the cameras finally cut, the studio remained quiet for several seconds longer than usual. Applause eventually came, not loud or explosive, but sincere. Peterson stood and extended his hand toward Roumie. The gesture was simple, unceremonious. Roumie accepted it with a nod. There was no performative warmth, no exaggerated camaraderie, just mutual respect. As they walked off set, producers and crew members watched silently. No one rushed forward with questions or comments. It was as if the moment deserved to be left undisturbed. Later, clips of the conversation would circulate online. Headlines would focus on the silence, on the pause, on the moment when Jordan Peterson had no words. But those who were there knew the truth. The silence wasn't a failure. It was the resolution. Because not every powerful conversation ends with an answer. Some end with a recognition that the deepest truths are not always spoken, but felt. And that night, the studio didn't just witness a conversation reach its end. It witnessed understanding find its limit and humility take its place. Long after the studio lights dimmed and the cameras were powered down, the silence from that night continued to echo, not in sound, but in reflection. Moments like that don't announce themselves as important when they happen. There's no dramatic music, no instant applause, no clear signal that something meaningful has just occurred. Instead, they arrive quietly, settle deeply, and reveal their weight over time. What people remembered wasn't a debate being won. It wasn't a clever argument or a flawless explanation. It was the pause. A pause that reminded everyone watching, whether in the studio or across a screen, that not all truth demands a defense. In a world obsessed with certainty, speed, and dominance, silence has become rare. We rush to respond. We argue to protect our identity. We speak not to understand, but to prove that we are right. And in doing so, we often miss the very thing we claim to be searching for. That night offered a different model. Jonathan Roumie didn't silence Jordan Peterson by overpowering him. He didn't outthink him or trap him in a contradiction. He simply spoke honestly about his limits, and in doing so, invited everyone else to confront their own. And Jordan Peterson didn't pause because he was defeated. He paused because he recognized something real. That distinction matters. Strength is often misunderstood as dominance. Intelligence is often mistaken for certainty. And faith is often reduced to an argument. But what unfolded in that studio suggested something deeper. True strength is the ability to remain open when your framework is challenged. True intelligence knows when analysis must step aside. And true faith doesn't shout, it stands quietly, waiting to be recognized. The moral of that moment isn't about choosing sides between reason and belief. It isn't about declaring one path superior to another. It's about humility, the kind that allows different truths to exist without forcing them into competition. Because life doesn't ask us whether we prefer logic or faith before it tests us. Suffering doesn't wait for our theories to be complete, and meaning rarely arrives in the form we expect. What that conversation revealed is something ancient and universal. That transformation often begins where self-sufficiency ends. Not in weakness, but in honesty. There is a reason why the most enduring wisdom across cultures speaks of surrender, humility, and grace. Not as defeat, but as doorways. Doorways into a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world. That doesn't mean abandoning reason. It means recognizing its limits. That doesn't mean rejecting strength. It means redefining it. Silence in that moment became a teacher. It reminded us that some truths cannot be explained into existence. They must be encountered, personally, painfully, and honestly. And when they are, words often fail. That failure isn't loss, it's invitation. An invitation to listen more carefully, to speak less defensively, to approach one another not as opponents, but as fellow travelers wrestling with the same questions. In the end, the most powerful thing that happened that night wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't. A man known for words allowed silence to stand. A man known for portraying faith allowed humility to speak. And an audience was reminded of something easy to forget. That meaning doesn't always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it arrives with stillness. So if there's one lesson to take from that frozen studio, one truth worth carrying forward, it's this. When someone speaks from the deepest place they know, listen. Not to respond, not to argue, but to understand. Because the quiet moments, the ones that stop us mid-thought, are often the ones that change us the most. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to pause, really pause, and reflect. Type SILNCE in the comments if you believe some truths are too deep for debate. And tell us where you're watching from, not to be counted, but to be connected. Because in a noisy world, choosing to listen might be the bravest act of all.